Alright, so we're going to pick it up with a PowerPoint that'll supplement what we were talking about last night for the first chapter here. And we've already covered this first part of it here with symbolic thinking. So we talked about the evolution of symbolic thought. Seems to be, right, remember we started burying people differently and all that from around 80,000. And then, or Homo sapiens sapiens. And then the limestone stuff I was talking about, probably about 40,000 BC. Remember this, if we looked at it thoroughly right now, we'd probably start even pushing that back, right? This is not really new stuff, but they're just finding, new sites and so forth all the time. It changes around quite a bit. Here's this next one, cave drawing, right? We didn't go through this too much last night, but you can see here, this looks simplistic, right? It is not, right? Not simplistic at all. And if you think about what you'd have to do to draw in caves back in the day, it's kind of like what we were talking about with the rocks and making stone tools. It's very difficult, right? And if when I've asked students in the past, I'll say things such as, well, if you're going to make black, right, for paint, what are you going to use? And the easy answer for that is, of course, something that was burnt. Right? We'll make for a good ash, good black color. Red for from berries, right? Probably green from berries or plants that you crush up or something like that. All right, to get to the colors. But think about, so you don't have all that many colors, not like we're going to see emerge. But furthermore, people not necessarily trained in the business, they're trained by other shamans, but no formal training like you're getting right now. And this is way deep in the middle of a cave, right? Where everything's pitch black. You're gonna have to crawl through spaces that are, very, very narrow to get to. And then you're gonna have to get up on something to get to this wall right after the cave opens up again. So how are you gonna see? Right? You're going to have a torch in one hand, and you're going to have to inflate the size of these creatures that you're drawing for the effect, because people are going to come in here. We're still not really quite sure what this is all about, but they think it had something to do with, they thought life emerged from the cave was a womb of the earth or something like that. So you'll see common animals here, like you can see the beginning of the horse here, right? And let me zap out of this a little bit here so I'll get my cursor. The tail right here, the eye, the beginnings of the mane back here. These are kind of stock symbols. Think about it as a little bit more representative. If somebody draws an arc like that, it's probably on some kind of beast, right? In this case, a horse, right? So all sorts of different creatures will emerge, but the sort of the weird thing about this is somebody tried to duplicate with all the formal training that living artists today get. They brought them into these caves and only let them use, right, what artists at the time, or the shamans probably at the time, would use. And we really can't do a whole lot better, right? You can't bring ladders in, right? Can't bring your modern art supplies in. Can't do any of that stuff. So it's not really clear that when I was talking last night about how maybe people had a little bit more going on upstairs than we thought, right? Or maybe even better than us is my idea, my opinion. So evidence for that, basically, right? And we talked a little about symbolic art, or symbolic thinking, Language and art are two examples, but how otherwise did we come about with symbolic thinking? And this is what I was drawing up for you all. I just had the triangles and stuff there. This is, of course, just kids bobbing for apples, and I would just use this as the springboard for the one-to-one relation for concrete nouns that I was talking about. Remember, abstract nouns, concepts, and when you start putting in, especially all like the modals for verbs and all that sort of stuff, we're up here communicating this way. All right, well, how? Why? Why do we think this way? Nobody knows for sure. Some of the best examples that I've heard are just in terms of basic evolution, predators and or proto-marriage, something like we're going to call marriage. So the theory goes, right? Let's just say that there was a shift for a time, maybe for a long time, where some of the stuff I was talking about digging tubers and all that sort of stuff last night. There's a shift for whatever reason. Maybe the climate just changes a little bit too quickly. Rainy season kills all of it or something like that. Start following herds of animals around for X years, right? It stands to reason, so the theory goes, that people will start getting separated from the group, right? Probably men going out and hunters and all that sort of stuff, right? This is going to tie into the marriage one, right? So if you are separated from the group, right? A guy named Terrence Deacon, by the way, is a big proponent of this. He's kind of a jack of all trades in these fields. Says, well, it must be the case, right, that men have got to know that their kids are theirs. But when you think about it, it's not just the people that are married, right? When you get married, right, maybe some of you are married, have been married, will be married, right? It's that everybody has to know, right? It's not, the marriage is not between the two people. It's an expression also to the community, right? So I think now you tend to think that it's just you two, right, when you get married. But no, now you're under different social security. Legally, you're a different entity now. Your insurance, right? All that sort of stuff. You are thought of differently after you are married. And besides the name changes and all that sort of stuff. Right, the other one's just predators. Right? Oh, excuse me. Before we get to that, with marriage, notice how all marriages, other than language, as we were talking about, somebody's going to say some words, and they're going to be special words for a marriage. But there's also the music, food. Nowadays we have things like maybe you used to tie each other's wrists back in the day. Now we exchange rings, right? Some sort of symbolic artifact there. It's giving a cloak to people. You see in some of the television series has picked up on this from way back in the day. All right, all these things signified marriage. Think about all the stuff that goes into it that shows everyone. So if we stick with the business from back in the day, well, the maybe the wounded or maybe just creepy guy or something like that's back in and stays in the cave, he's not off with the hunting party, he's got to know too, right? Not to, in essence, just sort of be a predator, right? And try to have sex with some of the women are left, because that's going to disrupt the whole tribe, right, is the idea for this. And so other people will say, if we switch for a minute, we just had to think and communicate because of predators, right? If we went through periods where we're basically getting torn up, right, by a certain predator, communication in and of itself can really help. Maybe it's a combination of all this. We really don't know. But you see this even now with monkeys, right? If you were to know the calls and you go and there's a group of monkeys foraging on the floor, right? And you know how to do the monkey call for there's a lion here. They're all going to jump in the tree real quick. And they seem to be able to distinguish between different predators. So something like that's taken on a much greater degree, basically, that we can do. But again, nobody really knows for sure, and all this is speculation. All right, as so much is before we get into the early civilizations, right? But what do we mean by a civilization? Well, remember from last night, this is when people more or less stay in one place, right? So then food supplies have to change. It's no longer foraging, hunting, things such as that. You're going to grow stuff. What's important to grow? Maybe a tree, right? Like the olive trees, as we're going to see next chapter. But usually it's like staple annual grains. Most of your annual grains, high in protein, right? We need a fairly high protein diet, right? If you think about that a minute, right, from the protoforms, it's very difficult to arrive at all this. If you haven't seen this before, wheat in its natural state, right before we civilized it, has a husk all the way around it. That's the natural state of wheat. it had to, so the birds don't eat it and whatever else is going through there. It makes it a lot more difficult anyway. What had to occur to people, right? What we nowadays would call a genetic anomaly, these wheat husks that grow up, the wheats that come up without the husk, the protective coating on it. Well, we're going to have to, somebody had to think you need to plant those. That's what you need to cultivate. We can do that by ourselves without waiting for them to come back next year or in the fall or something like that. Right? That's a pretty big leap, right? These are smart, again to my point, these are smart people. These are not stupid people. And another thing we're going to talk about in this class, if it's predicated off staple grains, water supplies, and so on, and it's showing the rainfalls in this area, but we're talking about through here, right, is where a lot of this stuff is. By the way, all the domesticated, most, not all, but the animals that are capable of being domesticated are right here. But it's going to depend on this, more or less, the staple annual grains, how things are spread, right? So if you can imagine for a minute, even now, if you go into Tractor Supply or Walmart, Lowe's, and you get you a packet of seeds. If you look on the packet of seeds, of course we're going to be concerned with America here, it's going to have these sort of waves that go around. So if you're in Texas and you have this kind of tomato, it's in, late April, probably or into early May, that you want to plant it in this area. And then you look and you say, well, if I'm up in Iowa, I want to plant this in later June, like right up here. And you never think, why is that? Well, it doesn't really occur to people when they buy the seeds. They just sort of go off what it is. But if you think about it, it's when the light is hitting the best and corresponding heat that's going to come from it, right? So you have a zone, and the zone typically goes horizontal, but it's much more difficult to move it vertically, right? If that's how that particular plant evolved. So from around here back in the day, you can take grains this way, right? But it's very difficult before, they're not evolving at the rate that we can evolve, then push them along now to go this way, right? So if you look just at if you look at the continents, right, this should be a civilized area. There's a lot of horizontal movement possible. The mountains are going to make it tough, don't get me wrong. But you can get where we're going to go from the Mesopotamia area, and you just stretch it down here into Egypt. It's not that big of a shift, right? You can spread grains this way in the east, and if we'll see later, we had a big Indian civilization through here. But more or less across, the Americas, you're going to tend to want to be stay moving, right? Even after some people do start relying on crops, you still have lots, bands of tribes still moving around. Same sort of thing in Africa, right? So vertical it's the background pressure, right? Not for all time, just the background pressure, because of the staple grains, right? So as we progress along, we're going to see this, and this would be broken up in different chapters, but you all tend to not like this as much because it'd be a lot more pages in other books that we'd use and that I've used in the past. If we go to Egypt now. Egypt, Nile River, right? This is, as it indicates in our chapter, the most important thing, right? The Nile River, back in the day, from the snowfall and further into Africa, and the Nile River flows this way, right? It flows north. It doesn't flow south. So from the south, the mountains, the snowfall and so forth on the mountains back in the day, as that melts in the spring, every spring brings floods. You had a very low floodplain. Upper Egypt, Lower Egypt. Look how in full flood here, this is before everything was dammed up, and this is a recreation. But if it's flooding this much, we would think of that as bad today, which is why we dammed it up. It causes all sorts of problems. But the good part of this back in the day is when the massive floods come, you can see it on your streets every once in a while when it happens. It also brings dirt, right? Or in essence, from the Nile, the reason Egypt becomes the breadbasket for staple annual grains in the ancient world is all the new dirt that's coming back here and here, new soil. So this is better than fertilizer, right? You're getting a complete new level of topsoil every single flood, right? Every year that it floods. And so the grains are just taken off, especially through here, but also the banks here, you get a lot more out of it than you would think off of it. The Egyptian, from the Pharaoh down, they had this huge bureaucracy and they had it measured off. Well, if they knew that it flooded, they had these little sticks set up with markers on them. And when it came up to a certain marker on a stick, whatever farmer was controlling this area was expected to give X amount of what we would call bushels, right? They had a little bit different measurement, the same principle, right? Down to a science for all that. Remember, Egypt was around, really in its heyday, around 3,000 years as the ancient Egyptian civilization, right? Or almost, all right? How would they get up and down that Nile River, the main point of transport? Back in the day, it was a reed boat. And then they did what all great civilizations do. They tend to want to control everything, right? So they ditched these reed boats for cedar boats, right? Where were the cedars? Nowhere in Egypt, right? Egypt was not good for cedar trees, oak trees, right? Anything that requires a whole lot of water over time, that's not Egypt, right? But they did desire the wood. So where did they get the wood? Same place that Solomon in the Bible, right? What we now call Lebanon, the cedars of Lebanon. They went in and made that a colony and harvested the timber there and brought it back, made the boats and all that sort of stuff. All right, so very valuable, those cedars of Lebanon from back in the day. Also, by the way, they colonized a city up there, Old Byblos, right? And we didn't get too much into scroll production last time, but somebody in Byblos decided to cut up scrolls to make them much more like a codex read, much more like what you have hopefully have in your hand in front of you right now, that's now commercially bound and all that sort of stuff. Just sort of cut up the scrolls and tied them together, made the beginnings of what we called a book, right? So, and because these were coming out of this geographic region, they called all books in this time period Bibles, right? And then we just sort of adopted it for the Bible later on. All right, so another kind of a key thing that wasn't in the chapter here, when we were talking about the mummies and the evolution of mummies and all that sort of stuff, this is an actual picture. This is not a recreation. This is an actual photograph of Ramses II, right? And you can kind of see this is the guy who, if all this is true, right, ran Moses out of Egypt. So we're going back to, I think it's 1200 BC or something, somewhere in there, 1500 BC. Probably a big cancer lesion right now, I think is somewhat what the doctors found out. Actually had red hair, which is really weird. We thought everybody would have black hair around there. Apparently this particular family didn't, and carried the trait through, the red hair through. So that's how well they could preserve bodies, right, from back in the day. And getting back to the idea of a house, here's what the plateau looks like right now as it's dug out. As we're going to see later, it's only for the West, only when Napoleon comes through, he kind of rediscovers all this. They knew about Egypt, but it was much more like a myth or something like that. This idea that the Egyptians were doing all the stuff that we know that they now were doing. And when Napoleon's their first general came through here, all this was covered up in sand right here. This is all, been dug out and kept dug out and all that sort of stuff. We do not see the pyramid like it was back in the day. It would have been a lot smooth. This is really deteriorated now. It'd have been a lot smoother back in the day with all the stones filled in, painted white, and across the top here would be thinly hammered gold. So that all around here for the workers and so forth, it's as if a ray of light, you kind of just made it fat on the bottom, right? Pointing exactly to the North Star back in the day. And some of you will invariably do your presentations on the pyramid. There are all sorts of weird mathematical proportions in here that we really don't understand how they knew how to do, especially much more build it. to the kind of astronomical and mathematical calculations that they did back in the day. All right, but if we want to think about, remember when we were talking about mummies and this idea of height in and of itself being important? Well, this is, if you picture this, maybe not as a huge gigantic pyramid like this is, if you just pictured this as maybe just a little shack, right? So because some guy, some important man decided that, remember how we talked about the ancestor offerings? When my ancestors come and give me beer and bread, some wine, it would be, my ancestors, I'm so important, I'm going to build some shade for my ancestors to come bask in, right? So I get a little lean-to looking thing, right? Or post some reeds on top of it, right? Well, already now you can see when the next guy comes along, he's going to have to demonstrate his importance. He was a much more important of a guy, and so it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But the buildings like this don't hold up in the ancient world, right? First of all, the substrate is awful, right? So second of all, they have no idea about rebar, much less concrete, right? We're going to see the Romans do concrete, as we're going to see. The winds, that sort of the desert storms that come up out of nowhere and put stress on the buildings, all of these things contribute to buildings just falling down, right? So as you sort of lose the practical aspect of it, and height in and of itself becomes important, right? That's the only reason. Let's just sort of see how high we can go to display power. Well, to get higher in the ancient world with this kind of building technology, not just here, but we're going to see in Central America later, you have to compress the weight toward the center, the weight of the building. So a triangle is a very stable platform, right? Because if we just imagined a rock here, see, it's kind of getting pushed off to the center, the weight. This has got carved out later in this particular pyramid. Most of them aren't carved out like this. And so that's not a magical reason. Everybody, apparently not this class, but in all previous classes, everybody wants it's aliens, right? Aliens had to be the common connection between the Egyptians and the Central Americans later on. But it's nothing of the sort. It's just a practical thing you have to do to go higher back in the day. They kept it flat a lot of times on, when we get to the Aztecs, as we're going to see later, they still kept doing stuff on the top. Some of it was pretty heinous, awful stuff, as we think of now. But the Egyptians kind of lost track of all that, and just for the sake of height, right? Everything was about eternity. The Egyptians started their calendars over again with a new pharaoh, right? Reset time. Time was thought of as circular as it was mostly around the world until Abraham comes. Abraham from the Bible, some people say his greatest contribution was, go forth. Start linear time. You are going to have all these descendants that do all this important stuff, right? So so the Egyptians could, we're going to look at some paintings next time in the rise of realism with the Greeks, but the Egyptians did not care about realism, right? They didn't think that was admirable in art. They wanted things that represented eternity, right? Stasis. They actually have, you can see it in the chapters in the book, these square diagrams that they would start the paintings off of, which is why you get these weird Egyptian poses, in large part because they were based off of the squares behind them, right? But if we, in this case, we go to a statue, right? This, in a sense, is kind of a perfect Egyptian thing. I should have blown this up a little bit more. But this is also on page 19 of the third edition, anyway, of Landmarks in the Humanities. So here this guy is stepping forward, but it's kind of like it gives the appearance that he's stepping forward in eternity, right? It's kind of stuck. To us, he looks really rigid, right? But that's kind of what they wanted, right? He's stuck in time, if you will, right? Also, and this is going to be true of the woman as well. Now she's got a little step going forward. They are the representation of a perfect human body. We have since we don't think of their bodies as perfect human bodies now. because now you would think, to me, it's like people would think maybe like a linebacker in football. This guy, maybe he's in shape, but he's not. He can't run a 4.2 40 and just level somebody, right? And he's like 260 or something like that. This guy's nowhere near 260. So, but if you think about it from their perspective, right? What they wanted with people, how can you take guys out and march them for like 3 weeks, and still you're going to have to fight the next day after you settle down in camp, right? You can't. You need endurance, right? You can't have someone too bogged down by the heat and not sucking up too many calories and water, right? So in terms of efficient, we're going to see this show up all over the world. This kind of form, very efficient, lean, can go for the long haul, but is certainly not like somebody out of the WWE or whatever people are into right now for wrestling, where everybody's all pumped up with the weights and all that sort of stuff. We don't really think of this type of body as perfection now, right? For the woman, think about it in terms of childbearing, right? She can have children, no problem, and feed the children, right? She is youngish looking in the childbearing years. And if anything, you're going to see a little bit later on, people are going to make bigger hips, right? But with smaller hips, you can move better, generally speaking, right? But easier for the kid to get out. A lot of people die. A lot of women died in childbirth historically. So larger hips are better, right? And I think I'm forgetting something right now, I know, but I think we're already going to be a devil of a time getting through this, getting this uploaded. So I'm going to stop it right now, and I'll add more later if I can think to.